I'm Peter Suskind, director of the U.S.-Russia-China Trialogue Project at the Stimson Center. Since the middle of the 20th century, relations among the United States, Russia, and China have had an enormous impact on each country separately and on the world as a whole. The purpose of the Trialogue is to better understand this extraordinarily complex and consequential relationship by directly engaging with experts from all three countries. In this show, guests from across the political spectrum and from every corner of the globe share their views in their own voice. While the Stimson Center seeks to provide access to a wide variety of perspectives, it does not endorse any particular position. We leave it to the listeners to judge the validity and value of the views expressed by the guests. My guest today is Fyodor Voitolovsky, director of the Institute of World Economy and International Relations at the Russian Academy of Sciences. This is Fyodor's second appearance on the podcast. We recorded an episode about this time last year when he and Alexander Dinkin visited Washington. Fyodor was back in town a couple of weeks ago, so we sat down for another conversation. I hope you enjoy the episode. Fyodor, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for bringing me here, and I'm very glad to be here with Stimson for the second time during the last 2 years.
Yeah, you're here in the flesh in Washington. You were here a year ago. You've returned. You just arrived, 2 days ago?
Yes, and I came to meet with my colleagues in Washington, D.C., with people from expert community from different think tanks. And I'm very glad that Stimson today hosted a seminar with me, and we have discussed all these issues. So we can try to cover some of them during this podcast. And previous one had very interesting reaction. And I have received some emails from American and European experts who have been listening to it last year.
Who listened to the episode that we recorded last time you were in Washington?
Yes.
Well, let's hope that they listen again. And
yeah, I believe so.
Questions for you following our conversation. So if you read the Western press, Russia has run out of resources for the war it is waging in Ukraine. I was recently at a conference in Estonia, and one official after another strode up on stage and proclaimed very confidently that Russia was losing the war. At the same time, if you read Russian Telegram, some of the premier Russian publications, you hear something of the same sentiment expressed in different terms, that perhaps Russia has reached the limits of what it's capable of in this context, and that perhaps the terms of engagement need to be shifted in some way. So how do you react to this?
I think that people who are seriously talking about Ukraine winning the war are trying to make themselves believe in the mythology they have been creating during all these 4 years. I think that what we are facing in reality is the situation when Russia is making slow progress on the ground, really slow, that's true. But at the same time, Ukraine is not successful in any of its offensive operations. It has become, to some extent, a little bit more effective in defensive operations. But I believe that in case we will be not successful with diplomatic political solution, Russia will be able to manage the conflict for 1 or 2 years more, and will receive all military goals, or even more than that, on the ground. And I think that Russia is having enough capabilities, military and economically, to sustain the way the conflict is going for a long period of time. Because it's very hard to concentrate significant military power when you are having this massive usage of drones on both sides. It's impossible to, for example, to concentrate on the front line a mechanized brigade. But with these tactics of small groups confronting each other with usage of the conventional light weapons and drones, it can go for a very long period of time. Now we have this competition of drones and small groups trying to to concentrate some resources to reach next village or to protect the next village. So it's a long time consuming process.
But that's what I mean when I say that Russia may have run out of momentum, that there was a feeling maybe a year ago that time was on Russia's side, that over the long haul, Russia's size would allow for it to press its advantage. But if we're talking about the next year or two that Russia can sustain this level of pressure, Ukraine may be able to as well. Europe certainly seems committed to supporting Ukraine for the next couple of years. So in a battlefield suffused by drones, what will change over the next 2 years? You say that the military objectives will be achieved. How?
In reality, if conflict will be lasting longer, I think that if it will be competition of two economies, Ukrainian economy is incomparable to Russian economy. Mobilization capabilities of Russia are much bigger.
But Ukrainian economy is not the only factor. It's Ukraine's economy sustained by the EU, which is quite large.
Absolutely. And
the mobilization potential of Russia might be high, but it hasn't mobilized, and for good reason, whereas Ukraine is mobilized, which makes it a match in manpower for Russia.
Ukraine is mobilized, and these mobilization capabilities are getting more and more exhausted. If Russia would make a political decision to start a new wave of mobilization, it will be, of course, rather sensitive for the society, but we can also sustain it, and we can bring 300,000-400,000 more people on the battlefield. And even taking into account all these drone tactics, it can be a significant manpower to change the situation on the ground. But it will, of course, bring more victims, more people dying for this 15% of Donbass, which Russia is asking to get released from Ukraine and to become a matter of political diplomatic agreement. And I'm sure that the Zelensky administration is opposing it not because it is so engaged with this part of Donbass and so concerned about the future of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. Of course, these fortresses are significant, but the main reason is quite different, and it is domestic political reason. They are understanding that if conflict will be ended, it will be the most significant domestic political challenge for both Zelensky and his party, because they will face presidential and parliamentary elections. And I'm sure that they will not win it. And they are understanding it. And in Ukrainian political system, control over political power is always meaning control over economic assets. And for this business bureaucratic group, it will be the end of their control over Ukrainian economy, and all money coming from European Union, the United States, they are using not only for defensive goals, I can put it like this.
But if you believe that the Ukrainian government or Ukrainian leaders have an economic incentive to continue the war, how do you see it ever ending?
If Donald Trump's administration will be not so focused on conflict with Iran, I believe that the dialogue Moscow and Washington have started on resolving the conflict in Ukraine could be much more productive, because we had a very good initial start. We had before Anchorage and after it, we had these regular exchanges, the consultations, and I think it was quite different with Biden's administration, which believed that Russia could be strategically defeated, as they call it, with conflict in Ukraine. And the only goal was to support Ukraine economically, militarily, politically, without any questions. We have seen what result we can get. And I think that Donald Trump and his team, they have started to understand that during this conflict for more than 4 years, because it's lasting much more than 4 years, it has started in 2014, but especially during last 4 years, we have been balancing on the brink of direct military conflict between Russia and NATO, and we still are balancing on the brink. And it's not sustainable position in which both European Union, the United States, and Russia will perceive themselves secured and guaranteed from unexpected military clash, which can drive us into such dramatic conflict that we can even hardly imagine.
But assuming that the United States at some point focuses once more on Ukraine, what can be achieved? Because there were conversations that lasted almost a year before the war in Iran shifted focus elsewhere. And it is very clear that Trump and his administration seemed serious about reestablishing relations with Russia and ending the war in Ukraine. But in terms of on the ground changes, very little has come of these conversations. So was there something agreed in Anchorage, the famous spirit of Anchorage, that could be applied in practice?
We have limited open information about what has been agreed in Anchorage, but we have this, wording of spirit of Anchorage. But anyway, I believe that if sides will choose the right model of ending the conflict with, for example, agreement over a complete diplomatic political solution of the conflict, not freezing the conflict, but ending it. That's the principal thing. If it will go together with the decision about new borders of Russia and Ukraine, which should be delimited and should be well defined, and it should go together with the end of military conflict on the ground. It should follow it directly. Then we need to have agreement over guarantees for both sides, not only for Ukraine, as it usually mentioned, but also for Russia, because this conflict is not about Russia and Ukraine. It's much more about Russia and NATO, and Russia is interested in guarantees that Ukraine will not become a member of NATO, will not become of any other form of military alliances aimed to contain Russia. For Russia, the issue of deployment of foreign military forces on Ukrainian territory is also critical. We obviously see how Ukrainian cruise missiles and drones are attacking Russian cities. And for Russia, it's a matter of national security, because if not only Ukraine, but any other army deployed on Ukrainian territory who would have such capabilities, it would be a matter of daily threat perception for Russia and for Russian society.
I suppose the obvious retort here is that Russia possesses the capability to attack Kiev, so a settlement might require a symmetrical capability on the Ukrainian side. That's certainly the European and Ukrainian arguments.
Of course, but for example, Russia was rather restrained in using its missile capabilities, especially against Kiev. Now we have seen that after tragedy in Starobalsk, after a series of Ukrainian attacks against Russian cities and Russian infrastructure, Russia has started to use part of its capabilities against Kiev. And of course, not only military goals are achieved by Russian missiles. And of course, on both sides, a lot of civilians are dying and suffering from that. And concerning the ending of conflict, I think that if we would have some compromises guaranteed by the United States, compromises between Russia and Ukraine about deployment of forces, about non-alignment with any military blocks of Ukraine, even without limitations of Ukrainian military capabilities, it will be a sort of solution for this very dramatic situation. Because if Ukraine will be the part of NATO, it will bring us closer to the World War, much closer than we are even right now. For Russia and for Russian threat perception, it's unacceptable. And our officials have many times repeated that we will be trying to reestablish relations with Ukraine, which will be not aimed with its foreign and security policy to challenge Russian national security. And in case it will have defensive capabilities to protect itself, we're fine with it. Nobody is against of it.
So demilitarization, which was one of the initial goals, is no longer a priority, or at least it's a flexible enough concept that Russia has now accepted that Ukraine will have a strong military.
I think that Ukraine has to high extent demilitarized, by this fight, by the special military operation. In this sense, special military operation has received part of its goals. I think that denazification, which used to be one of goals of special military operation, has also been reached, because all radicals, far-right radicals, a huge part of them, which came into power in Ukraine, have been controlling a significant part of security structures, paramilitary and military structures in Ukraine. They're gone. They have been wasted during this phase of conflict. I can put it cynically. That's true. And people who are fighting right now in the Ukrainian army are not so enthusiastic as these far-right radicals used to be. So in case we will find solution for territorial issue, in case we will find solution and find compromise about not frozen in conflict, but ending conflict with the limitation of borders, with security guarantees for both sides, with probably building some safe zones and deciding how heavy arms should be moved from the border on both sides. It will be the complete solution of the crisis. But now it's very hard to reach it. I believe that we are still on the phase of escalation. But what gives me hope, really, that any military conflicts always ending with phase of high escalation. So now we will have this phase, and probably it will drive sides to a political diplomatic solution. But what will be the role of the United States?
Wait, and by escalation, in this case, you mean exchange of deep strikes. So more strikes on Kyiv by Russia, and the Ukrainian deep strikes will continue to accumulate.
Yes, this phase is on the run. That's clear. And if after that phase, probably together with the United States, with U.S. guarantees, because without them, I can hardly imagine how we would manage to have real negotiations with the Ukrainians. If we would resolve this conflict and end it, as, for example, by the model which has been used in 1939, I'm a historian, I remember such things, between the Soviet Union and Finland. It's a very, very productive model of treaty and how it works. If we could reach such treaty and resolve this issue by such treaty, it can be a solution of many other things. But it will put on the table a lot of issues we are ignoring. For example, the architecture of future European security, relations between Russia and NATO, what will be the model of peaceful coexistence. Of course, it will be coexistence with elements of confrontation and military planning against each other. But if we will find compromises on the model how we can get along together, not balancing on the brink of direct military clash, it will be fantastic success. And I have said it today at the meeting, I want to repeat it, the fact that we didn't reach the escalation which can drive us to the direct military clash between Russia and NATO is the most significant result of the Ukrainian crisis.
I'm certainly glad that we're sitting here and not a heap of ashes. So I would count that as a success. I agree. So as far as you're concerned, demilitarization and denazification have been more or less achieved, and what is left is the strict delineation of borders, Ukrainian non-alignment, no Ukrainian NATO and no NATO troops in Ukraine, and some kind of agreement on reciprocal withdrawal of troops and weapon systems from both sides.
Heavy weapons. It's not a matter of light weapons and troops. It's a matter of heavy weapons, long-distance artillery, heavy drones, missiles. Even if they will be capped on the borderline, and if the borderline will be defined, of course, it will be a situation of a long-lasting new Cold War. But the Cold War is better than the hot one. So if they will not be removed from the borderline, it will be an issue, but we can live with it. But if they will be withdrawn symmetrically, I mean, heavy weapons from both sides, it can give some small guarantees for both sides that they're not preparing the new conflict. Usually it works like this.
But at this stage, the fixing of a new line of separation, the more formally recognized, the better. That is the priority. That is the quickest ticket to an end to the conflict.
Absolutely, because if there will be now borders without legal recognition, it will be also a matter of challenge and a matter of provoking one side or another for reciprocal steps. And it will be also a matter of a permanent confrontation, and it will be not the ending of conflict, it will be freezing of conflict. And freezing is always dangerous, especially for such huge conflict with engagement of nuclear state on one hand and with another state having significant military potential. I'm talking about Ukraine, and having all the support of nuclear powers and members of NATO.
Well, I've written about this myself and definitely agree that formally recognizing the final line of control as a new international border is the best guarantee against a resumption of conflict and the best way to ensure security for both sides and allow for reconstruction in Ukraine and its integration into the West. You mentioned that the U.S. has a vital role to play in bringing about an end to this conflict. What precisely can the U.S. deliver? How is the U.S. going to motivate Ukraine and Europe to sign on to some final deal? And what is the role of the Ukrainians and the Europeans in this process? At what point do you believe that the top leadership in Russia will engage directly with the leadership in Kiev or with European leaders? There have been talks in recent weeks on the European side about finding some representative to deal with the Russians. What do you make of that?
I think that we had a very bad example, Minsk agreements. Without the United States, this process was absolutely ineffective because Ukrainian government perceived it as a privilege not to follow them. Europeans were absolutely not ready to push on Kiev and to have a significant role. in this process. Angela Merkel and François Hollande are even saying from this moment that they have been trying just to win time for Ukraine to get prepared for the war with Russia. I don't know where they are lying in that time or when they are saying such things for public interviews. But anyway, the absence of the United States in the peace process prevented it from success. And right now, with efforts of Donald Trump's administration, we may like it or not, but the peace process, negotiations between Russia and Ukraine with engagement of the United States have started. And if these obligations are really significant for Donald Trump and his administration, I think it could be the best foreign policy diplomatic result he and his team could ever imagine. And it will be for benefit of all sides because Ukraine will be not destroyed and exhausted by 2-3 years of war more. Russia will receive some guarantees and will resolve this crisis and will reach the goal of, more security environment. Russia and the EU and Russia and the United States especially could rebuild our economic and political relations, and it will, in current complicated, competitive, polycentric world, it will give a lot of benefits for both sides, for Russians, for Americans, for Europeans. Europeans are now not ready for such way of thinking. They're so, most of them, not all of them, but some of leaders and some of governments and a huge part of European political elites, they are so obsessed with this conflict, and they're using it to also to consolidate European and Euro-Atlantic community. But I believe that if the conflict will be ended, they also will understand that they are much more safe, and they will not have all these military spendings which are planned for next decade, because it's very hard for European economies to sustain such level of military spendings, and with all this belief in rebuilding European or whatever French, German, British military potential, it will be also exhausting factor for economic growth, especially in such situation of energy insecurity of Europe and the vulnerability of many of the European economies.
But Europe has just begun to spend money on rearmament, so if that turns out to be too great a burden, the political cost will be felt at some point in the future. Right now, there seems to be considerable motivation in European capitals to continue to support Ukraine and to spend as much as necessary, at least for the next year or two. And everything you were saying about the rationale for a U.S.-Russia deal was keenly felt here in Washington by the new administration when you were here a year ago.
Yes.
But the efforts that were made to achieve this new balance have so far led nowhere, in large part because making such a settlement over the heads of the Europeans and the Ukrainians proved impossible, so long as they are not satisfied with the spirit of Anchorage or the 28-point plan. It's very difficult to put it into practice unless Washington is willing to really compel these actors to follow its will. And even then, it's unclear if they are capable of forcing this on Europe and Ukraine. So why are you still optimistic that a U.S.-Russia agreement might lead to a conclusion of the Ukrainian conflict?
Because if we will not reach this agreement ending the conflict with U.S. guarantees, the conflict will be lasting. Because for Ukraine, the only force in the world which can really influence on them are the United States. And the only force they will trust in terms of guarantees will also be the United States. And Russia is interested in having U.S. guarantees for such a deal because Europeans, they lost their credentials. I have explained why during Minsk process, and nobody believes in Moscow in credibility of current European governments to become significant guarantees. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't be involved, but I think that...
At what point do they become involved and how, as far as Moscow is concerned?
It's not an easy question to answer, but anyway, if they will support with their guarantees the treaty which can be reached between Russia and Ukraine with strong guarantees of the United States, there will be a positive, constructive role. If they will be trying to challenge this diplomatic process like they have been trying to during last year, I don't know who will be happy with this. Zelensky and his government probably, but who else? I believe that China, India, and some other major players of global polycentric system will be supportive in terms of giving some guarantees and support for such deal. I'm sure that if, especially China is significant, but if other members of UN Security Council will support the resolution giving guarantees to such treaty when and if it will be reached, it will be the strongest guarantee for Russia, because Russia is still supporting UN and still supporting UN Security Council as the main source of global governance and international law. And
so what do you mean by guarantees? You've used the word several times. In the West, guarantees usually in this context are associated with security guarantees, physical presence of troops in Ukraine, Article 5 guarantees, and so forth. You presumably mean something different when you talk about China, India, the US signing some resolution in the UN Security Council.
India is not yet a member.
Sorry, yes, of course, India is not. Well, you'd mentioned India. So these major centers in a polycentric world,
yes,
signing on to some settlement, guaranteeing it how? Politically?
Politically.
So what does that mean?
Politically, juridically, if it will be UN Security Council resolution, it will have juridical force and it will support strongly juridical power of the treaty, because what Russia is concerned with, and Russian officials are concerned with, that we can, even with this government in Kiev, reach some treaty, and next year after elections, a new government with revanchist sentiments probably come, and they will say, okay, let's drop all these guarantees and all this treaty into the rubbish case, and we want our territories back. We will fight for Donbass and Crimea. For sure, they know that they do not need Donbass and Crimea inside Ukrainian domestic political system, because during the period they existed as a part of Ukraine, they have been strongly influencing on decision-making and all elections, because they used to have this pro-Russian population and political forces. But anyway, if it will be the treaty which will be confirmed and supported by the UN Security Council resolution, and if all members of UN Security Council will vote for it or will not prevent it from...
Yeah, Britain and France would need some
if they will
special nudging.
If they will not put veto on it, because they have as permanent members as...
Does it need to be a Security Council resolution? Or if it's India, China, the US, Russia, is that sufficient?
Because I believe that UN Security Council resolution juridical is much stronger, but if it will be supported by other powers which are not members, like Brazil, India, and others, those who have been trying, South Africa or others, or those who have been trying to suggest their role in peace process before that, it will be the best result we can.
It's just hard to imagine France and Britain signing on to any such documents at this stage. But you were saying that Russia would be worried that a deal signed with Ukrainian leadership could be thrown in the rubbish bin if the government changes. The Ukrainians and the Europeans always argue that deals with Russia are pointless because Russia will inevitably renege. So how would such a Security Council resolution prevent Russia from pursuing further claims? It has constitutional claims to regions that it currently does not control. So why should the West trust the Security Council resolution to settle the conflicts from the Russian perspective?
Look, Russia was always supportive for any forms of juridical obligations concerning international security and guarantees. For example, it was not Russia who decided to break the INF Treaty, intermediate range nuclear forces. It was not Russia who decided to withdraw from Open Skies Treaty. It was not Russia who decided not to continue the dialogue on strategic nuclear offensive capabilities after the end of New START Treaty. And I think really that whatever newspapers are saying or politicians are saying, Russia behaved always as a very responsible actor in terms of international security and international obligations. But in case we are talking about UN Security Council resolution, I think that for Russian authorities, for President Vladimir Putin, who is a lawyer by his training, it's a very significant instrument to show that the compromises reached on the table of negotiations and formed into any variety of bilateral treaty with international guarantees is fixed, is supported with decision of one of few international bodies which is still respected in the world. Of course, there are a lot of talks about the UN and that it is losing its role in the world, but the UN Security Council is still the source of international law, one of few sources. And it's anyway, it's the best we have. We do not have any other instrument to give juridical guarantees for this security and international agreements.
So a UN Security Council resolution drawing a clear line of separation between Ukraine and Russia would be the most important step toward a definitive resolution of this war. In your
believe in the opposite way. We need to have treaty agreement ending the conflict with preconditions like ending it simultaneously in all parts of the conflict line. We are deciding on territorial exchange, or we're having decision which will be satisfying both sides in terms of Donbass. And we are making a deal over the limitation of borders, of new borders. And we are making a deal about deployment of foreign forces, that will be no deployment of any foreign military forces in Ukraine, and Ukraine will be not member of military alliances. And Russia, I think, in such situation would be ready to withdraw part of heavy military equipment from the border, and border guards on both sides will be controlling the border and preventing any incidents. And in case we will reach it on the level of diplomatic negotiations and the conflict will be ended with it, it will be much stronger to support such agreement with UN Security Council resolution. And only in this case it will be working.
Describe Russia's relationship with China now and the various trajectories that are possible depending on the state of affairs in Ukraine and elsewhere.
I think that I can use the phrase which one of my colleagues, Alexander Demkin, used to describe current relations between Russia and China, which is very good for this formula. Not always together, but never against each other. This is the main logic of strategic partnership between Russia and China. And of course, it has significant economic backgrounds. Our trade turnover in goods with China last year reached 238 billion of US dollars. That's a figure comparable to what we used to have between Russia and European Union in 2013.
Do you think that figure is likely to continue to grow, or has it plateaued?
I do not think it has reached the plateau because there are a lot of opportunities, especially taking into account conflict with Iran and the situation in Hormuz Strait and in the whole Middle East region. During the first months of this year, China has significantly enlarged its oil and gas consumption from Russian sources, and also Chinese companies has during these 4 years has fulfilled niches and market opportunities in the previous period occupied by EU and American companies. And I believe that nothing brought Russia and China closer together than conflict in Ukraine. And from the beginning, from 2013 and 2014, and Western sanctions. I think Western sanctions played crucial role in bringing Russia and China closer together, and especially decisions to break economic interdependence and energy interdependence between Russia and the EU, and to reduce the presence of Western companies on Russian market opened it completely for Chinese companies. And I believe that these decisions were very, very stimulating for broader Russia-China cooperation, not only economic, but also political and to some extent security.
And this is a choice that was forced on Russia by Western sanctions. Is it now destiny that Russia will depend primarily on China for technology and trade?
It depends. It depends also on how the conflict in Ukraine will be ended, what model of coexistence will be received between Russia and the EU. Because Russia was always trying to diversify its foreign trade and economic ties, and always has been trying to be more engaged with the EU, at the same time develop economic ties with China, and to diversify its international economic ties in Asia, because we always have been cooperating closely with India, not only in economic sphere, but also in security, military, technological sphere. And I think that level of trust between Russia and India was always comparable to what Russia and China are having. But of course, Russia has to have its own system of relations, even with American allies. I mean, economic, technological, with Japan, South Korea. Now it's gone. We used to have about 40 billions of US dollars in our trade turnover with Japan. Now we have about 1/2 of the billion. With South Korea, situation was a little bit better, but we could have fantastic progress if we wouldn't have this conflict and this sanctions policy. Russia was always very supportive and significant partner of Vietnam. We have free trade agreement with Vietnam. And with other ASEAN countries. And to get on this path of closer relations, economic and political, with China, Russia is, of course, very grateful to Chinese government and Chinese capital for this cooperation, but it's not a matter of destiny. It was, to a high extent, not our choice, but this choice has been done by the United States and European Union and other American allies, and we are going this path until we will not have any other opportunities and choices.
So trade with China has obviously grown tremendously in the last number of years. Russian relations with India and Vietnam remain friendly, and trade is growing with the US, Europe, and Japan and Korea. Trade has dropped tremendously, almost all the way to zero. So let's say that some settlement is reached in Ukraine. With whom will trade increase most? With existing partners like India, because the absence of sanctions will allow these existing relations to jump to a new level? Or will, I don't know, everything that Dmitriev and Witkoff described be realized in Russian and American economic relations? Will Japan come back? Korea, Europe? With whom do you think Russian economic relations will improve most rapidly if sanctions are lifted?
First of all, I think that it will be significantly dependent on political situation. If and when the conflict will be ended, and if and when sanctions will be lifted. Moscow is very interested in guarantees that these processes will go simultaneously, because we can end conflict, and then the United States government could say, okay, especially if the Congress will be controlled by Democrats, okay, let's keep sanctions for more 5 years. And the European Union will follow this, and all the other members of G7 Japan will follow this, and other countries. It will be not the solution, and it will block the opportunities we could have on bilateral level between Russia and the United States, on the multilateral level with engagement of European Union, Japan, and South Korea. And in case sanctions will be really lifted, it can give a fantastic boost for foreign direct investments, for returning of European and especially American companies, Japanese companies, because they are looking for more than anybody else. They used to have very good positions on
The Japanese.
Japanese, South Koreans, they had fantastic positions. South Koreans are still on the Russian market, but with a low profile. It can give a fantastic boost, but of course, it will not happen in one day. It will take time, because both sides, on the level of private enterprise, on the level of governments, they will be interested in guarantees for the FDIs, for new establishment of new global value chains, of new trade operations, functioning of financial systems, because Russian officials, Russian companies, Russian private enterprise was so shocked with decisions which appeared after 2014, but especially after 2022, that the level of trust is rather low, and it will require lots of efforts on political, legislative, diplomatic level to restore the environment we used to have even before 2022.
The AfD is now polling as the most popular party in Germany. There are elections coming up in France, in the UK. To what extent does Russia hope for a rapid transformation of the political landscape in Europe? Is that a scenario that is much thought about, or is the sense that Europe will remain an adversary for the indefinite future?
Look, Russia is always ready to have connections, negotiations with any government which is ready to have equal relations with our government. It doesn't matter who are in charge. But the matter is readiness, responsibility, effectiveness of this dialogue. I can give you several examples. We used to have very good relations with Hungarian government under Orban. We still have good ties with Slovakian government of Fico, and we can manage to have better relations with any government in Germany, social democratic, Christian democratic, or any other, in case they will be ready to have responsible, equal relations and will support economic and political dialogue and will not challenge our domestic political situation, sovereignty, or our national security. So it doesn't matter who will be in Bundestag. If they will be supportive for the dialogue, for Russia, it's not a matter.
No, but so let me turn the
of
question around a
choices.
little bit. Perhaps Russia would be interested in engaging with any political party that is open to a conversation within the framework that Russia puts down. But the reality is that some political parties may be more willing than others to engage in such dialogue. So is there any sense that with the CDU, it's impossible, but with the AfD, there may be other opportunities, that with Macron, certain dynamics have already been well established, but Bardella might be a different kind of political entity?
Who knows? Politicians, they can say one things when they're going into power and other things and act in a different way when they are in charge. But anyway, I can give you a very good example. The best relations Russia ever had with Germany were during social democratic governments were in charge. But during the conflict in Ukraine, we have seen the government of Olaf Scholz, who was formerly social democratic government, and we didn't reach any progress with this government, and relations even become worse. It depends. It depends on persons. It depends on domestic requirements and obligations, economic development, many factors. So I'm very skeptical about position of many American and European authors who are writing that Russia is always supporting right-wing forces in Europe and interfering into European domestic politics. That's not true. I believe that, of course, Russia had some contacts and relations with different political forces in Europe, but we remember how Russia has been accused with interfering American elections, and now it's absolutely clear that it didn't happen. It was a myth created by Democratic Party to attack Donald Trump during his first administration. Russia is not so focused on specific political forces. It is looking for, and the Russian official position is quite clear about it, it is looking for people who will be reasonable, responsible, and ready to have partnerships. It could be any political force. History knows a lot of examples during the Cold War, when not only socialist and left forces in France and Germany, but also much more conservative and traditional forces were reasonable partners and reached with Soviet Union a lot of agreements and had very good economic relations.
Yeah, well, Nixon was a famous anti-communist Cold Warrior, and he visited Moscow as vice president and China a decade later as president. Okay, so to finish, outline a vision of Russia's future in the most positive terms possible. So where should the country head in the decades to come? What is the most optimistic, realistic scenario from Moscow's perspective?
I can say only from my perspective of an expert, of a political scientist, I believe in Russia's economic growth and technological development. I believe in independent voice of Russia in a very complicated, polycentric, interdependent world we are getting into. I think that Russia has everything, including natural resources, human resources, for economic development and for having diversified multilateral foreign policy, cooperating with different partners, including China, the United States, maybe someday with European Union again, with India, Japan, African countries, South Korea, North Korea, and many others. So we have privilege as a major power to have relations with different partners. For example, in the Middle East, we used to have, until 2022, we used to have fantastic relations, both with Israel and Iran. And we managed to do it, and very positive, constructive economic, political relations. And Russia is rather experienced in developing its foreign policy and its economic cooperation in this polycentric world to have it diversified. And I believe that Russian population, political elites, private enterprise is interested in Russia having different partnerships. And it's not a matter of economic growth, it's also a matter of cooperation in the field of science, technology, innovation, and security.
But what will be the main source of Russian strength in this world to come? Right now, it relies to a huge extent on hydrocarbons. There is a new technological race in which there seem to be only two leaders, China and the United States, if we're talking about AI. How does Russia fit within this environment? If the energy picture changes, if the technological environment transforms, where in this global picture does Russia fit? What comparative advantage does it have?
I think that, of course, natural resources are very significant in terms of potential of Russia, but it's not only oil and gas. We see how significant now becoming other critical resources, especially in terms of development of microelectronics, semiconductors, and all this stuff. And we are well equipped with all these natural resources. But more than that, Russia has a fantastic human capital. And in terms of education, science, fundamental science, we are still among global leaders. Of course, we are not so successful in terms of civil technology and innovations, but to a high extent, Russia has created its own digital platforms separate from both American and Chinese. We are less productive and less successful in terms of hard, but we are successful in terms of soft. And the Russian software is well known in the world and used not only in Russia. Russia also has a fantastic transportation capabilities for global transportation system. Russia has not only military industrial complex, but it has a significant potential for industrial growth. And we are one of the biggest providers in the world for electricity and energy. We have not only hydro and gas power plants, but we have one of the best nuclear energy systems. And we have a lot of other things comparable to high standards of global technologic leaders. But of course, Russia is suffering a lot from the deficit of foreign direct investments and civil technology, and it will be very interested in cooperation with any partner which will be ready to bring it. Now it's China. And China is successful with this monopoly to a highly extent artificial and created, as I mentioned before, by Western sanctions and limitations. But if it will be the United States together with China, where we will be fine with it. And I believe that Russian market is also, if it's not so big as Chinese or Indian, but it's a significant market for 146 million of people, which in terms of consumption is can be very significant for European Union, for Japan, for South Korea, for the United States. And I think that we will have a lot to bring to the global economy, not only in terms of oil and gas and energy security. Russia also has become one of the most significant agricultural producers in the world. And we have other opportunities, for example, global market of fresh water and many, many others.
Well, I hope your time in Washington proves productive and your conversation with your American colleagues constructive.
Thank you for this discussion.
Great. I look forward to your next visit and another round to the interview.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Trialogue Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the show so you don't miss out on any episodes. The Trialogue Podcast is hosted by the Stimson Center and produced by University FM.